The autumn wind whispered through the tall prairie grass, carrying with it the scent of sage and approaching winter. Caroline Hall stood at her husband's freshly dug grave, her black mourning dress whipping around her legs as she stared at the wooden marker. Sheriff Luke Hall had been gunned down 3 days ago, they said, by the notorious McKenna brothers during a bank robbery in Pueblo. But something about the official story didn't sit right with her. Luke had been acting strange in the weeks before his death, distant and secretive, spending long hours away from home. The modest wooden church behind her creaked in the wind as the last of the mourners departed, leaving Caroline alone with her thoughts and the endless Colorado plains stretching to the horizon. At 32, she was now a widow, but more than that, she was a woman with questions that demanded answers. Luke's deputy, Nathan Carter, had been suspiciously quick to wrap up the investigation, claiming the McKennas had fled south toward Tucson. Caroline knew better than to trust the official story. That evening, as she sorted through Luke's belongings in their small house on the outskirts of Pueblo, she found a hidden compartment in the bottom of his gun chest. Inside was a leather-bound journal filled with cryptic notes about meeting times and locations, along with references to someone called the Colonel and mentions of Confederate gold. The last entry was dated just 2 days before Luke's death, describing a rendezvous at an abandoned mission near Durango. Caroline's hands trembled as she read through the journal entries again and again. The writing revealed a side of Luke she'd never known, calculating, secretive, possibly corrupt. But the most damning evidence was a draft of a letter claiming she, Caroline, had been stealing from the town's treasury and planning to flee with the money. The pieces started falling into place, forming a picture she didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore. In the following days, Caroline formulated her plan. She had grown up on a ranch with 3 brothers, knew how to ride and shoot as well as any man. With her slight build and delicate features, she could pass for a young man with the right clothing and a few careful adjustments. She cut her long brown hair short, bound her chest tight, and dressed in Luke's old clothes. In the mirror, a slender young cowboy stared back at her. Word around town was that the McKenna brothers had been spotted near Wichita, but Caroline knew better. The journal pointed to Durango, and that's where she would start. She hired on with a cattle drive heading south, introducing herself as Cal Hall, a young ranch hand looking for work. The trail boss, an aging cowboy named Isaac Lopez, barely glanced at her before adding her name to the crew roster. The cattle drive provided perfect cover for her journey, allowing her to travel south without arousing suspicion. During the long days in the saddle, Caroline learned to deepen her voice, to walk with a masculine swagger, to spit and curse with convincing authenticity. The other cowboys accepted her without question, too focused on their own hardships to pay much attention to the quiet young hand who kept to himself. At night, while the others played cards and shared stories around the campfire, Caroline would study Luke's journal, memorizing names and locations, piecing together the complex web of betrayal that had led to his death. The McKenna brothers weren't just random outlaws. They were part of something bigger, something that involved stolen Confederate gold and corrupt law enforcement across 3 territories. As the cattle drive wound its way south through the Colorado Territory, Caroline caught whispers of other crimes: bank robberies, murdered lawmen, disappeared witnesses, each incident connected somehow to Luke's cryptic notes about the Colonel and his operation. The more she learned, the more she realized that bringing the McKennas to justice wouldn't be enough. She needed to expose the entire organization, even if it meant destroying her husband's reputation in the process. One evening, 2 weeks into the drive, a rider approached their camp carrying news from Pueblo. Deputy Nathan Carter had been found dead in his office, shot through the heart. On his desk was evidence suggesting he'd been blackmailing several prominent citizens. Caroline listened to the gossip around the campfire, her heart pounding as she realized the conspiracy was unraveling. Someone was tying up loose ends, eliminating anyone who knew too much about the Confederate gold. Caroline kept her face carefully neutral as the cowboys discussed Deputy Carter's death, though her mind raced. She had known Nathan from her days as Luke's wife. He'd been one of the few who treated her with genuine respect rather than barely concealed disdain for a woman wearing a badge. Now she wondered if his kindness had been genuine or part of an elaborate deception. The cattle drive provided perfect cover as she processed this new information. During the long days pushing the herd across the dusty plains, she could piece together the fragments of Luke's betrayal while maintaining her disguise as just another hired hand. The endless horizon of golden grass beneath vast blue skies felt both liberating and oppressive. So much space to hide secrets, yet nowhere to truly escape them. That night, she slipped away from the campfire to review Luke's journal entries by lantern light. The mysterious Colonel appeared repeatedly, always in relation to shipments moving through Durango. Caroline had assumed they were ordinary cargo runs, but now she saw the pattern. The dates aligned perfectly with Confederate gold shipments that had vanished during the war's chaotic final months. A cold wind whipped across the prairie as she connected more dots. Isaac McKenna, the eldest brother, had served as a Confederate cavalry officer, the same unit that had been tasked with moving the South's remaining treasury west as Richmond fell. If Isaac had helped divert that gold, it would explain how the McKennas had suddenly acquired enough capital to build their criminal empire. The next morning brought more revelations as the drive passed through a small settlement. Caroline overheard two merchants discussing recent bank robberies, not just the money, but specific documents that had been taken. Property deeds, shipping manifests, anything that could prove ownership of certain assets. Someone was systematically erasing the paper trail of their operation. She found herself studying the other drovers more carefully now, wondering who else might be part of this web of corruption. Joshua, the trail boss, had worked these routes for years. He knew every marshal and sheriff from Tucson to Wichita. How many of them were on the McKenna's payroll? How deep did the rot go? During the afternoon rest, Carolyn carefully approached Charlotte, an older cook who had worked cattle drives for decades. The woman had a reputation for knowing everyone's business along the trail. Under the pretense of sharing coffee, Caroline steered their conversation toward the recent troubles. Charlotte's weathered face grew serious as she spoke of changes in the territories. New money flowing in, old families being pushed out, strange accidents befalling those who asked too many questions. The drive was now less than 2 days from Pueblo, where Caroline knew she would have to make her move. Luke's journal mentioned a meeting scheduled there between Isaac McKenna and the colonel. If she could catch them together, she might finally uncover the full scope of their operation. But Nathan's murder was a warning. They were watching, eliminating threats. One wrong move and she would join him. That evening, as the sun painted the prairie sky in shades of blood and gold, Caroline made final preparations. She cleaned her rifle methodically, checking and rechecking every component. The weapon had been Luke's wedding gift to her. Another bitter irony. Tomorrow she would ride into Pueblo, not as a grieving widow seeking justice, but as a federal marshal determined to expose a conspiracy that threatened to corrupt the very foundations of law in the territories. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. A rider was approaching from the north, kicking up dust in the fading light. Caroline's hand moved instinctively to her weapon as Joshua called out a challenge. The stranger's response made her blood run cold. It was Eleanor, Luke's sister, who had no earthly reason to be this far from Wichita unless something had gone terribly wrong. Eleanor dismounted in a flurry of dust and skirts, her normally composed demeanor shattered by evident distress. Caroline noticed her sister-in-law's hands trembling as she clutched a leather satchel close to her chest. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard as Joshua led Eleanor's horse to the stable, casting worried glances over his shoulder at the two women. "They found Luke's ledger," Eleanor whispered hoarsely, her eyes darting to the darkening horizon. "The one he kept hidden behind the false wall in his office. Caroline, there are things you need to know. Terrible things that change everything we thought we understood about his death." She pulled a worn leather-bound book from her satchel, its pages dog-eared and stuffed with loose papers. Caroline led Eleanor inside, her mind racing. The cabin felt suddenly claustrophobic, its familiar walls closing in as she lit the oil lamp with unsteady hands. The ledger landed with a heavy thud on the rough-hewn table, and Eleanor began pulling out documents, bank drafts, telegrams, and coded messages that painted a devastating picture of corruption. "Luke was working with Isaac McKenna for months before his death," Eleanor explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "These records show regular payments, coordinated shipments, details about Confederate gold being moved through Durango. He was planning something big, something that would have implicated you if it had gone wrong." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Caroline's fingers traced the familiar handwriting, her husband's careful notation of dates and amounts now transformed into evidence of his betrayal. Each entry felt like a physical blow, destroying the foundation of everything she'd believed about their life together. Caroline Hall slipped silently through the bustling streets of Durango, her long duster concealing both her true identity and the twin colts at her hips. 6 months of living as Caleb Wilson had taught her to move with the measured swagger of a man, to pitch her voice low and gruff when forced to speak. The summer heat pressed down on the town like a wool blanket, but she kept her hat pulled low, hiding the delicate features that might give her away. Her singular focus drove her forward, finding the McKenna brothers who had murdered her husband Luke. In the crowded saloon, she nursed a whiskey while eavesdropping on the conversations around her. Trail hands and miners swapped stories between shots of rot gut, and she'd learned that gathering intelligence required infinite patience. A weathered cowpoke named Joshua Carter had mentioned seeing the McKenna's distinctive brand on cattle being driven north toward Pueblo. It was the first solid lead she'd had in weeks. The door swung open, spilling harsh sunlight across the sawdust floor. Nathan Lopez strode in, his silver marshal's badge catching the light. Caroline's heart clenched. He'd been Luke's deputy, and she wondered if he'd recognize her despite the disguise. But his eyes slid past without a flicker of recognition as he made his way to the bar. She released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Later that evening, Caroline made her way to the livery stable where she'd boarded her stallion. The stable boy, young Isaac Nelson, was currying her horse with careful attention. The boy had taken a shine to Caleb and often shared the local gossip he overheard. Tonight, his eyes were bright with news as he described overhearing two ranch hands discussing a hidden canyon where the McKennas were supposedly holding stolen Army payroll gold. Dawn found Caroline riding north, following the cattle tracks Joshua had mentioned. The vast prairie stretched endlessly before her, broken only by the occasional rocky outcrop or cluster of cottonwoods. A dozen riders appeared on the horizon, driving a large herd. Through her field glasses, she could make out the distinctive Embarque brand. Her patience had finally paid off. She'd found the McKenna's operation. For 3 days, she shadowed the cattle drive from a distance, watching through her glasses as the riders made camp each night. She recognized the brutal faces of the McKenna brothers from the wanted posters she'd memorized. But it was the sight of another familiar figure that made her blood run cold. Eleanor Carter, the widow who'd consoled Caroline after Luke's death, was riding with the outlaws and sharing their campfire. Caroline's mind raced as she pieced together the implications. Eleanor had known details about Luke's death that hadn't been made public. She'd steered Caroline's grief toward revenge while subtly directing her investigation. Now here she was, clearly intimate with the very men Caroline had been hunting. The terrible suspicion that had been growing in Caroline's mind began to crystallize into certainty. In the growing darkness, Caroline crept closer to the outlaws' camp, close enough to hear their conversation. The McKennas were arguing about dividing shares of Confederate gold. Gold that Luke had supposedly been transporting when he was killed. But their words painted a very different picture. Luke hadn't been ambushed while pursuing the gang. He'd been working with them all along, planning to disappear with the gold and leave Caroline to take the blame. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. Every memory of her marriage took on a darker cast as Caroline realized how thoroughly Luke had deceived her. Their life together had been built on lies, her grief and quest for vengeance carefully orchestrated to serve as a convenient cover story. She felt sick remembering how she'd mourned him, how she'd risked everything to avenge a man who had planned to destroy her. The camp grew quiet as the outlaws settled in for the night. Caroline withdrew silently, her mind churning with new purpose. The McKennas would still pay for their part in Luke's schemes, but now she had a broader web of corruption to unravel. Eleanor's involvement suggested others in Durango might be implicated. Nathan's convenient absence during key moments took on new significance. The truth she sought was far uglier than she'd imagined. Dawn painted the distant plains in shades of amber as Caroline made her way back to Durango, her horse's hooves kicking up dust from the drought-parched earth. She kept to the shallow arroyos and patches of scrub brush, avoiding the main trails where the McKenna gang might spot her. The revelation about Luke's betrayal had sharpened her instincts. She could no longer afford to trust anyone's surface appearance. In town, she noticed subtle details she'd missed before. How the bank manager Nathan always seemed to have fresh horses despite the shortage affecting other ranchers. How certain cattle drives coincidentally matched the timing of gold shipments. The pieces were fitting together into an elaborate network of corruption, with Luke and the McKennas as just one part of a larger scheme. At the boarding house, Caroline carefully maintained her male disguise while gathering intelligence. Other guests spoke freely around who they assumed was just another cowhand, sharing rumors of strange activities at Eleanor's ranch. Apparently, large shipments arrived at night, only to disappear by morning. The ranch hands were all new faces, none local to the area. She spent several days observing Eleanor's property from distant ridgelines, noting the regular arrival of heavily laden wagons that never seemed to leave with their cargo. The ranch's location near the old Confederate supply routes couldn't be coincidence. Caroline recalled Luke mentioning those routes during their marriage, always with careful casualness that now seemed calculated. The drought had cracked the earth into a maze of fissures, and Caroline used them to work her way closer to Eleanor's main barn one moonless night. Voices drifted through gaps in the weathered boards. She recognized Isaac McKenna's gravelly drawl discussing supply lines and payment schedules with someone whose cultured tones matched Nathan's careful pronunciation. Pressing herself against the barn's sun-bleached walls, Caroline heard fragments that confirmed her suspicions. The Confederate gold was just the latest target in a long-running operation. Luke had been their inside man in law enforcement, using his position as sheriff to redirect investigations and control information. His death had been staged to throw off any outside scrutiny. The pain of Luke's betrayal fueled Caroline's resolve as she ghosted back to her hiding spot in the hills. She'd need proof to bring down the entire operation, not just the McKennas, but the respectable citizens of Durango who'd hidden their crimes behind legitimate businesses. The drought-stricken ranchers and struggling farmers deserved to know why their community was failing while certain people prospered. At first light, Caroline rode to a remote line shack she'd discovered while tracking the gang. Inside, she spread out Luke's old case notes, papers she'd taken from his office after his death. Reading them now with fresh understanding, she began marking locations and dates that matched the pattern of mysterious shipments and bank transactions. Her husband's meticulous documentation of his own crimes would help bring down the empire he'd helped build. The summer heat bore down mercilessly as Caroline worked, sweat darkening her disguise's borrowed shirt. She'd need help eventually. There were too many moving pieces to handle alone, but trust had become a luxury she couldn't afford. Each potential ally would have to be vetted carefully, their motivations examined for any hint of connection to the conspiracy. Through her spyglass, she watched dust clouds rising from the direction of Pueblo. More wagons approaching Eleanor's ranch. The drought had driven honest ranchers to desperate measures, making them vulnerable to whatever scheme the conspirators were running. Caroline added another note to her growing map of corruption. Soon, she would have enough evidence to act, but timing would be crucial. One wrong move would alert the entire network. In town, she noticed Charlotte, the telegraph operator, watching her with unusual interest. The woman's gaze held something beyond mere curiosity about a stranger. Caroline remembered Luke mentioning Charlotte occasionally, always in that same carefully casual way. Another thread to investigate, another potential ally or enemy in this web of deception that had ensnared Durango. Caroline adjusted her bound chest beneath the rough cotton shirt, a constant reminder of her dangerous masquerade. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Durango's main street as she made her way to the telegraph office, her boots stirring small clouds of dust with each deliberate step. She had learned to move like a man, shoulders square, chin lifted, stride confident but not swaggering. The disguise had become a second skin over these long months of pursuit. Charlotte was alone inside, her fingers moving deftly across the telegraph key as Caroline entered. The operator's eyes flickered up briefly, then returned to her work with studied casualness that seemed forced. The rhythmic clicking filled the small space as Caroline pretended to write a message, watching Charlotte's reactions in the clouded wall mirror. Something in the way the woman's shoulders tensed told Caroline her presence had disrupted more than just the afternoon routine. "Message from Pueblo," Charlotte announced suddenly, tearing the paper from her pad. "For Eleanor's ranch." She hesitated fractionally before adding, "I was about to send someone out with it." The invitation in her tone was clear, an opening Caroline couldn't ignore, despite her instincts screaming caution. Luke had trusted Charlotte, but Luke's judgment was now suspect in everything. The ride to Eleanor's sprawling ranch gave Caroline time to think. The drought-parched grass crackled under her horse's hooves, and in the distance, cattle moved like dark specks across the golden plain. Eleanor had been expanding her holdings aggressively, buying out smaller ranchers who couldn't weather the dry season. The autumn wind whipped across the plains outside Durango as Caroline Hall crouched behind a fallen cottonwood, her heart pounding beneath the tight fabric binding her chest. Through her spyglass, she watched the McKenna brothers gang lounging around their hideout, an abandoned ranch house nestled against rocky hills. After 6 months of tracking them while disguised as Carl Hall, the moment of vengeance for her husband Nathan's death was finally at hand. Luke McKenna sat on the porch cleaning his rifle, while his brothers Caleb and Joshua played cards at a rickety table. Caroline's fingers tightened around her Winchester as she thought of how they'd gunned down Nathan in the streets of Durango. But something had been nagging at her ever since she'd infiltrated their gang 3 weeks ago. Why did they seem genuinely surprised when she'd mentioned Nathan Hall's name? The autumn sunset painted the plains in amber hues as Caroline inched closer through the tall grass. Her mind drifted to the letter she'd found hidden in Nathan's study after his death. Correspondence with a Mr. Lopez about Confederate gold shipments and railway schedules. She'd dismissed it initially, but now the pieces were starting to form a disturbing pattern. The way the McKennas spoke of a double-crossing lawman who'd tried to steal their claim to the gold. A horse whinnied nearby and Caroline froze. Through the swaying grass, she spotted Isaac Nelson, the gang's scout, riding back toward the hideout. He'd been in Durango that morning, and Caroline had overheard him planning to meet with a mysterious contact. As he dismounted, she could see him clutching a familiar-looking leather document case, one she'd last seen in Nathan's office the day he died. "Found these in the old Hall place," Isaac called out to the others. "Seems our dear departed sheriff was quite the schemer. Got papers here proving he was working with Lopez to move that Confederate gold right under everyone's noses. Was going to pin it all on his pretty wife, too." The McKennas gathered around as Isaac pulled out documents. Caroline's blood ran cold as she recognized Nathan's handwriting. The truth hit her like a physical blow. Nathan hadn't been an innocent victim. He'd been working with Ricardo Lopez, the notorious gold smuggler, to steal the Confederate treasury shipment. The McKennas were just hired guns, but Nathan had planned to betray them all. He would have framed Caroline for the theft while he escaped with Lopez and the gold. The grieving widow would have hanged while he lived like a king. Rage and heartbreak warred in Caroline's chest as she processed this revelation. The man she'd loved, mourned, and sought to avenge had been plotting her destruction all along. Her finger trembled on the trigger as she sighted down the rifle barrel at Luke McKenna's back. But could she still kill them, knowing they weren't truly responsible for destroying her life? Before she could decide, hoofbeats thundered from the east. A cloud of dust heralded the arrival of Ricardo Lopez himself, flanked by half a dozen riders. Caroline recognized him from wanted posters, a dapper man in an expensive suit, out of place on the rugged frontier. The McKennas raised their weapons, but Lopez merely smiled and held up a familiar gold pocket watch, Nathan's prized possession. "Gentlemen, I believe we have unfinished business," Lopez called out smoothly. "Sheriff Hall may have betrayed us all, but the gold shipment arrives tomorrow night. I have new papers that will get us past the military escort." Caroline's mind raced. This was bigger than personal vengeance now. An entire Confederate treasury shipment was at stake, along with the lives of innocent soldiers guarding it. The next few moments would determine not just Caroline's fate, but the course of justice itself. She could reveal herself and stop Lopez's plan, but that would mean giving up her chance for revenge against the men who killed Nathan, even if he had deserved his fate. Or she could maintain her cover as Carl Hall and try to thwart the heist from within. As the sun sank toward the horizon, Caroline made her choice. With deliberate movements, she emerged from the grass and strode toward the gathering of outlaws. "Evening, gentlemen," she called out in the gruff voice she'd perfected over months of disguise. "Seems like you could use another gun for tomorrow night's work." Lopez studied her through narrowed eyes while the McKennas exchanged glances. Everything hinged on what happened in the next few seconds. Lopez smiled thinly and gestured for Caroline to join them. As she approached, she noticed Isaac Nelson watching her closely. Had he recognized something familiar in her features? She'd have to be careful. The Confederate gold shipment, Nathan's betrayal, and her own quest for justice were about to collide in ways none of them could predict. And Caroline Hall was the only one who knew the full truth. The campfire cast flickering shadows across the faces of the gathered outlaws as Caroline took her place among them. The weight of her hidden derringer pressed against her ribs, a constant reminder of the dangerous game she was playing. Lopez spread out a crude map drawn on yellowed parchment, detailing the route the Confederate gold shipment would take through a narrow pass just north of Pueblo. The familiar terrain made Caroline's stomach clench. It was where Nathan had died, or so she'd thought. "Gold's moving at dawn," Lopez explained, his scarred finger tracing the path. "2 wagons, military escort of 6 men." He glanced at Caroline. "Hall here makes 7 of us. Perfect numbers to take what's ours." The irony of his words wasn't lost on her. Nothing here was truly theirs, least of all her identity or loyalty. The McKenna brothers nodded their approval, while Isaac continued watching her with unsettling intensity. The night grew deeper as they refined their plan. Caroline volunteered to take the high ground with a rifle, knowing it would give her the perfect vantage point to act when the moment came. Her mind raced with possibilities. She could warn the escort, but that would mean revealing herself. Or she could wait until the chaos of the ambush to make her move. The answer came when Isaac finally spoke up. "Reminds me of a job we pulled with Nathan Hall last spring," he said casually, though his eyes never left Caroline's face. "Similar setup, similar take. Shame how that ended." The others grew quiet, and Caroline felt the tension rise like a summer storm. They were testing her, she realized. Nathan must have told them about her, prepared them for the possibility she'd come looking for revenge. Her careful disguise suddenly felt paper thin. Drawing on months of practice, Caroline kept her voice steady. "Heard about that job. Messy business." She took a long pull from the whiskey bottle being passed around, letting the burn steady her nerves. "But tomorrow's a new day." The McKenna brothers exchanged knowing looks, while Lopez cleaned his pistol with methodical precision. The trap was closing around her, but she wasn't sure who was the hunter and who was the prey. As the others bedded down for the night, Caroline took first watch, her back against a sun-warmed boulder. The prairie stretched endless and dark around them, broken only by the distant lights of a Pueblo ranch. She thought of Nathan, of all the lies he'd told her, of the life they'd built on shifting sand. The Confederate gold had corrupted him long before his supposed death, and now it threatened to destroy what remained of her world. Dawn approached with agonizing slowness. Caroline checked her weapons one final time, the rifle she'd been given, her hidden derringer, and Nathan's old Colt she'd carried since his death. The eastern sky began to pale, and with it came the sound of wagon wheels in the distance. Lopez gave the signal, and the gang moved to their positions. Caroline climbed to her perch, setting up the rifle with precise movements. The first shot came from Isaac's position, a warning that kicked up dust near the lead wagon's wheels. The military escort reacted exactly as expected, forming a defensive circle around the wagons. Caroline had a clear shot at several of them, but held her fire. Through her scope, she saw Lopez and the McKennas emerging from cover, guns blazing. The moment of truth had arrived. With fluid motion, Caroline swung her rifle toward Lopez just as Isaac's voice rang out behind her. "Nathan said you'd come, Caroline." She rolled sideways as his bullet kicked up rock splinters where she'd been laying. The disguise was blown, but so was Isaac's advantage. He'd revealed himself too soon. Her derringer barked twice, and Isaac stumbled backward, surprise replacing the triumph on his face. The battle below had devolved into chaos. Caroline used the confusion to her advantage, picking her shots carefully. One of the McKenna brothers fell, then another. Lopez was shouting orders, trying to salvage the ambush, but the military escort had rallied. Through it all, Caroline moved like a ghost, her every shot backed by months of practice and years of rage. When the dust settled, the Confederate gold remained secure in its wagons. Lopez lay wounded, but alive, cursing in Spanish as soldiers bound his hands. The surviving McKenna brother stared at Caroline with a mixture of fear and respect as she approached, her disguise now discarded. She had what she'd come for, not revenge, but justice. Nathan's betrayal still burned, but she'd stopped his final scheme from succeeding. The military captain approached her, taking in her true appearance with surprise. "Ma'am, we had intelligence about this ambush, but nothing about you." Caroline nodded, knowing her story would raise difficult questions. But as she watched the prisoners being led away, she felt the weight of her quest finally lifting. The truth about Nathan would come out, and with it, her own redemption. The open prairie beckoned, offering a new horizon and the promise of a life no longer defined by lies and vengeance. Caroline Nelson stood at the crest of a windswept hill overlooking the McKenna brothers' hideout, her disguise as a male bounty hunter now meaningless in the face of the devastating truth. The setting sun cast long shadows across the plains, painting the scattered ranch buildings in shades of amber and blood red. Her hands trembled as she gripped the worn leather journal she'd discovered in Luke McKenna's saddlebag. Page after damning page of her late husband Nathan's betrayal laid bare in his own handwriting. Below in the valley, horses stamped restlessly in their corrals while cattle lowed in the distance. The McKenna brothers' sprawling ranch operation had always been a front, she now knew, for something far more sinister. Her fingers traced the detailed maps Nathan had drawn, showing the location of Confederate gold shipments and the careful plans he'd made with the gang to intercept them. The final entry revealed his ultimate scheme, to disappear with the fortune while ensuring his own wife would take the fall. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Joshua Carter, the youngest of the McKenna gang members and the only one who'd shown her kindness during her weeks of infiltration, reined his horse to a stop beside her. "They know," he said simply, his voice heavy with regret. "Isaac saw you reading the journal. They're coming." Caroline nodded, having expected this moment would come. What she hadn't expected was the soul-crushing weight of learning that everything she'd believed about her marriage had been a carefully constructed lie. Down in the ranch yard, men were mounting up. She could see Isaac and Caleb McKenna leading the charge, their faces twisted with fury even at this distance. They'd trusted Nathan Nelson, considered him a brother in their criminal enterprise. His widow's presence threatened everything they'd built. Caroline checked her pistols with steady hands, the familiar weight of the weapons grounding her in this moment of crisis. "You should ride out," she told Joshua. "This isn't your fight." But Joshua Carter remained, drawing his own weapon as the thunder of approaching horses grew louder. "Your husband was a traitor to everyone," he said quietly. "To you, to the gang, to the badge he wore. Someone needs to make this right." Caroline felt a sudden kinship with this young outlaw who'd found his own moral compass in the midst of corruption. Together they took up defensive positions behind a rocky outcropping as the first bullets began to sing past their heads. The battle that followed would be spoken of in whispers for years to come across the territory. Caroline's marksmanship, honed through months of preparation for her revenge, proved devastating. 3 of the gang fell before they reached the hilltop. Isaac McKenna took a bullet through the shoulder but kept coming, his face a mask of hatred. Caleb McKenna's horse went down, sending him sprawling, but he rolled to his feet with guns blazing. Joshua provided covering fire as Caroline worked her way around to flank their position. Time seemed to slow as Caroline finally came face to face with Isaac McKenna, the man who'd been her husband's closest conspirator. "He never loved you," Isaac spat, blood staining his shirt front. "You were just another piece in his game." Caroline's response was a single shot, placed with surgical precision. As Isaac fell, she saw a flash of movement and spun to find Caleb McKenna almost on top of her, his knife glinting in the dying light. Before he could strike, Joshua's bullet took him in the back. The aftermath was deathly quiet save for the whisper of prairie grass in the wind. Caroline found herself standing in the McKenna brothers' office, surrounded by proof of years of carefully planned heists. Maps, ledgers, and correspondence revealed a criminal empire that stretched from Tucson to Wichita. And there, hidden beneath a false floorboard just as Nathan's journal had indicated, was the Confederate gold. Enough wealth to build a small kingdom or destroy countless lives. Joshua watched silently as Caroline sorted through the evidence, separating documents that implicated her husband from those that named other corrupt officials across the territory. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "We'll turn the gold over to the territorial authorities in Pueblo," she said, "along with proof of everyone involved, except you." She held his gaze. "You've earned a chance to start fresh." The young outlaw nodded, understanding the gift of redemption she offered. As dawn broke over the plains the next morning, Caroline Nelson rode east toward Durango, her saddlebags heavy with evidence that would expose a web of corruption and bring justice to those who deserved it. The woman who'd set out seeking simple revenge had found something far more valuable: the truth about herself and the strength to forge a new path. Behind her, the McKenna brothers' ranch burned, a cleansing fire that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Joshua Carter watched her go, then turned his horse west toward distant horizons. He carried with him a letter of introduction Caroline had written, vouching for his character to a marshal she knew in Tucson. Sometimes, they both had learned, the road to redemption began with a single act of mercy. The prairie wind caught the smoke from the burning ranch, carrying it high into the morning sky like a signal flag of change sweeping across the frontier. The legend of the woman who brought down the McKenna gang would grow over the years, though few ever knew the full truth of Caroline Nelson's story. In saloons and around campfires, they spoke of justice and vengeance, of betrayal and redemption. But Caroline herself had found peace in the knowledge that she'd turned her husband's final betrayal into something that served the greater good. The frontier was changing, and she had helped to shape that change, one bullet and one truth at a time. Caroline's journey didn't end with the burning of the McKenna ranch. In the months that followed, she rebuilt her life in Pueblo, using her portion of the recovered Confederate gold to establish a small but respectable boarding house. The town council had initially balked at a woman running such an establishment alone, but her reputation as the marshal who brought down the McKenna gang, though few knew she and that marshal were one and the same, gave her the leverage she needed. On quiet evenings, she would sit on her front porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of amber and rose. The sound of cattle being driven to market would drift up from the stockyards, reminding her of simpler times before betrayal had reshaped her world. She kept her marshal's badge locked away in a cedar box, along with her husband's wedding ring and the wanted posters of the McKenna brothers. Some memories were better left undisturbed. Eleanor, who had helped her through those dark days of disguise and deception, became her closest friend and confidant. Together they turned the boarding house into a sanctuary for women seeking to escape their own troubled pasts. Caroline found a different kind of justice in this work, not the swift retribution of the gun, but the steady healing of broken spirits. She never forgot Joshua Carter's words about redemption being found in unexpected places. Word reached her occasionally about Joshua's new life in Tucson. He'd made good on her letter of introduction, earning a deputy's badge and a reputation for fairness that drew comparisons to Caroline's own brief but memorable tenure as a marshal. She smiled at the irony of how their paths had crossed and diverged, each finding their own way to make peace with the past. The remaining McKenna fortune, after restitution was made to their victims, went to establishing a fund for the widows and orphans of lawmen killed in the line of duty. Caroline insisted on this, knowing that while her husband's betrayal had sparked her quest for vengeance, the true meaning of justice lay in helping others heal. The bank in Durango managed the fund, and each quarter she received reports of lives changed for the better. Sometimes, in the deep of night when sleep proved elusive, Caroline would remember the moment she discovered the truth about her husband's involvement with the McKennas. The pain had dulled, but the lesson remained sharp. Justice and vengeance were different paths leading to the same crossroads, and the choice of which to follow defined not just the journey but the traveler. News of Nathan McKenna's death in a prison brawl reached her one autumn morning. The last of the brothers was gone, and with him, the final thread connecting her to that chapter of her life. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet acknowledgement that some stories ended not with a bang, but with a whisper, fading like hoofbeats in the distance. The boarding house became known as a place where second chances took root and flourished. Women arrived with haunted eyes and hunched shoulders, carrying burdens as heavy as any Caroline had borne. They left standing tall, their spirits strengthened by the community they found within those walls. Rose, a young widow from Wichita, became Caroline's assistant and eventual partner in the enterprise. Years passed, and the frontier changed as Caroline had known it would. Railroad tracks stitched the prairie together, and telegraph wires hummed with the news of a shrinking West. But in her boarding house, the old values of strength, resilience, and redemption lived on. She had traded her marshal's star for a different kind of authority, the power to help others find their way back from the darkness she knew so well. On the 10th anniversary of the day she'd first donned men's clothing to seek vengeance, Caroline hosted a quiet dinner for Eleanor and Rose. They raised their glasses not to the past but to the future they were building, one act of kindness at a time. The setting sun caught the window glass, casting long shadows across the dining room floor, reminding them all that even the darkest paths could lead to light.